In the quiet corridors of Buckingham Palace, where secrets whisper through centuries-old walls, and tradition governs every breath, Princess Anne stood frozen outside her father's private study. The usually composed Princess Royal, known for her unwavering strength and no-nonsense approach to royal duty, felt tears streaming down her cheeks for the first time in decades. What she had just heard through the slightly ajar door would change everything she thought she knew about her family, her father, and the weight of the crown that had shaped their lives. King Charles III, the man who had waited 74 years to wear the crown, had just shared something so deeply personal, so unexpectedly vulnerable, that it shattered every assumption about what it truly means to be sovereign. The wish he had confided to his closest aide wasn't about legacy, power, or even the future of the monarchy. It was something far more human, far more heartbreaking, and infinitely more profound than anyone could have imagined. This is the story of that moment, and the 5 conversations that followed, each revealing layers of a family bound not just by duty and tradition, but by love, regret, and the universal desire for redemption that connects us all. Princess Anne had never been one to eavesdrop. Throughout her 73 years of life, she had maintained a strict code of honor that kept her away from palace gossip and private conversations that weren't meant for her ears. But on this particular Tuesday afternoon in March, as she walked through the familiar hallways of Buckingham Palace toward her father's study to discuss upcoming royal engagements, something made her pause just outside the heavy oak door. The voice she heard was unmistakably her father's, but it carried a tone she had never heard before. King Charles III, who had spent his entire life preparing for the throne, who had faced public scrutiny, personal challenges, and the weight of centuries of tradition with remarkable composure, sounded completely broken. "I wish I could go back, Michael," the king was saying to his private secretary, Sir Michael Stevens, a man who had served the royal family for over 3 decades and had become one of Charles's most trusted confidants. "I wish I could go back and be the father they needed me to be when they were children, the father they deserved," and felt her hand freeze on the door handle. She had come to discuss the upcoming visit to Scotland and the charity events she would be attending in her father's name. But now she found herself unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to do anything but listen. "Your Majesty," Sir Michael's gentle voice responded, "you did your best with the circumstances you faced. The pressures on the royal family during those years were unprecedented." "No," Charles interrupted, his voice thick with emotion. "That's what everyone says, what everyone wants me to believe. But I know the truth, Michael. I know what I prioritized, and it wasn't my children's emotional well-being. I was so consumed with my role as heir to the throne, with fulfilling my mother's expectations, with proving myself worthy of the crown that I would one day wear, that I forgot the most important role I would ever have, being their father." And pressed her back against the wall, her heart pounding. In all her years, through all the family difficulties, the divorces, the scandals, the public criticisms, she had never heard her father express such raw vulnerability about his parenting. Charles had always been reserved, dutiful, committed to his royal responsibilities above all else. But what she was hearing now was the voice of a man filled with regret. "I think about William and Harry constantly," Charles continued. "William carries the weight of future kingship with such grace, but I see the distance in his eyes sometimes. The formality that exists between us that I never intended but somehow created. And Harry," the king's voice broke completely. Harry felt so alone, so misunderstood, that he felt he had no choice but to leave everything behind. "My own son felt he couldn't come to me with his pain, couldn't trust me to understand or protect him." Sir Michael remained quiet, understanding that sometimes the greatest service he could provide was simply being present while the king worked through emotions he rarely allowed himself to express. And, Charles whispered, his voice so soft that she had to strain to hear, "My daughter, my strong, incredible daughter who has given everything to this family, to this institution, who has never complained, never asked for recognition, never demanded anything for herself. She learned from watching me that love in this family is conditional, that acceptance is earned through service rather than simply given because you exist," and felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. She had indeed learned those lessons, had built her entire life around the principle that royal duty came before personal needs, that service to the crown was the highest form of love she could demonstrate. She had never questioned this approach because it was what she had observed in her father, what had been modeled for her throughout her childhood. I look at my children now, Charles continued, and I see how they parent their own children. William with George, Charlotte, and Louis. He's present in a way I never was. He knows their friends, their favorite foods, their fears and dreams. He coaches George's football team, reads bedtime stories, takes family holidays where being a prince is less important than being a father. And I realized that William learned what not to do by watching me. The weight of this revelation settled heavily on his shoulders. She thought about her own children, Peter and Zara, and how she had raised them with the same emotional distance that had characterized her own upbringing. The cycle of royal reserve, of putting duty before emotion, had been passed down like a crown jewel, precious but cold. What haunts me most, Charles said, his voice growing stronger but more pained, is not the public criticism I've faced over the years, not the challenges to the monarchy, not even the personal heartbreak of my marriage to Diana ending so publicly. What haunts me is that my children learned to be strong by learning not to need me. They learned independence by learning that they couldn't depend on me being emotionally available. Sir Michael finally spoke, his voice gentle but firm. Your Majesty, perhaps it's not too late to change some of these patterns. Your relationship with William has evolved tremendously since you became king, and your grandchildren adore you. The grandchildren, Charles said with a slight laugh that held more sadness than joy. Yes, they love their grandpapa, and I love them beyond measure. But, even there, I see how careful I am not to overstep, not to interfere with William and Catherine's parenting. I'm so afraid of making the same mistakes that I sometimes feel I'm barely present even when I'm with them. And thought about the family gatherings she had attended over the past few years, how she had observed her father with his grandchildren. She had noticed his delight in their company, but also the careful way he interacted with them, always deferring to their parents, always maintaining appropriate boundaries, rarely allowing himself the spontaneous joy that grandparents traditionally share with their grandchildren. I've spent my entire life preparing to be king, Charles continued, studying history, learning about governance, understanding the constitutional role of the monarchy. But no one ever taught me how to be a father while also being heir to the throne. No one showed me how to balance the public duty with private love. My own father was a good man, but he was a product of his generation and his own royal upbringing. He showed love through duty, through service, through preparing me for my future role. But what I needed sometimes was just to know that he enjoyed my company, that he was proud of me not because I was fulfilling royal obligations, but simply because I was his son, and realized that she was crying now, silent tears that she quickly wiped away with the back of her hand. She thought about her relationship with her own father, how much of their interaction revolved around royal duties, charitable work, and family obligations. When was the last time they had simply enjoyed each other's company, without the weight of royal responsibility hovering over their conversation? I have a profound wish, Michael, Charles said, his voice becoming clearer, more determined. Before my time as king comes to an end, I want to try to rebuild those relationships. I want to find a way to be the father my children needed all along, even though they're grown now with children of their own. I want William to know that I see him not just as my heir, but as an extraordinary man who has become everything I hoped he would be despite my shortcomings, not because of my guidance. And felt her breath catch. This was not the reserved, duty-bound father she had known all her life. This was a man who had finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of his choices and their consequences. I want to find a way to reach out to Harry, Charles continued, his voice breaking again. I know he's built a life in America. I know he feels he had to leave to protect himself and his family, and I respect that. But I need him to know that my love for him was never conditional, even when I failed to show it properly. I need him to know that losing our relationship has been one of the greatest heartbreaks of my life. Sir Michael's response was gentle but practical. Your Majesty, some of these relationships may take time to rebuild. Years of patterns don't change overnight. I know, Charles replied. But I also know that I'm 75 years old, and I don't have unlimited time. I've spent so much of my life waiting to marry the woman I truly loved, waiting to become king, waiting for the right moment to make changes. I don't want to wait anymore when it comes to my children." And heard movement in the room and realized that the conversation was coming to an end. She quickly stepped away from the door, her mind racing with everything she had heard. She needed time to process this revelation, time to understand how this new knowledge would change her relationship with her father and her understanding of their family dynamics. As she walked quickly down the hallway toward her own office, Anne's mind was flooded with memories from her childhood and adult life, all now viewed through the lens of what she had just learned. She thought about the formal birthday dinners, the Christmas celebrations where protocol took precedence over spontaneity, the way she had learned to measure her father's love through his approval of her royal duties rather than his delight in her as a person. But she also thought about moments she had perhaps misunderstood, times when her father had seemed distant but might have been struggling with the balance between his public role and his private feelings. She remembered occasions when he had shown pride in her accomplishments, but had expressed it in formal, reserved ways that she had interpreted as emotional unavailability rather than recognizing them as his best attempt to show love within the constraints he had learned to operate under. For the first time in her life, and began to see her father not just as the king, not just as the man who had raised her to prioritize duty above all else, but as a fellow human being who had struggled with impossible expectations and was now facing the consequences of choices he had made under tremendous pressure. As she sat in her office, staring out at the London skyline, and realized that she had a choice to make. She could pretend she hadn't heard her father's confession, could continue their relationship as it had always been, formal and dutiful and safe. Or she could find the courage to bridge the gap between them, to help her father fulfill his profound wish while also addressing the patterns that had shaped their entire family. The decision, she realized, would require her to be vulnerable in ways that went against everything she had been taught about royal behavior. But, for the first time in her life, and found herself wondering if perhaps there was something more important than royal protocol. The possibility of authentic connection with the father she had always loved but never felt she truly knew. For 3 days after overhearing her father's conversation with Sir Michael, Princess and found herself unable to concentrate on anything else. She attended her scheduled engagements, met with charity representatives, reviewed correspondence, and fulfilled her royal duties with her characteristic efficiency. But her mind kept returning to the vulnerability in her father's voice when he had expressed his profound wish. On Friday morning, as she sat in her private study at Gackham Park, her country home in Gloucestershire, and made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. She would speak with her father, not as princess royal to king, but as daughter to father. The conversation would require her to step outside every boundary of royal protocol she had ever known. But she could no longer pretend that what she had heard hadn't fundamentally changed her understanding of their relationship. She called Buckingham Palace and requested a private audience with the king for the following afternoon. When asked about the nature of the meeting, she simply said it was a personal family matter. Sir Michael, who arranged the appointment, seemed to sense the gravity in her voice and assured her that the king would have as much time as she needed. Saturday arrived with an unusually warm spring day and drove herself to London, something she did less frequently now, but still insisted upon when she wanted time to think. During the hour-long journey, she rehearsed different ways to begin the conversation, but each approach felt inadequate for the magnitude of what she wanted to discuss. When she arrived at Buckingham Palace, the familiar surroundings felt different somehow, as if seeing them through the lens of her father's confession had altered their meaning. The grand hallways that had once represented tradition and continuity now seemed to emphasize the isolation that came with royal life. The portraits of ancestors that had always provided a sense of historical connection now felt like silent witnesses to generations of emotional distance maintained in service to duty. Sir Michael greeted her personally and escorted her to her father's private study, the same room where she had overheard his conversation 3 days earlier. As they walked, he mentioned that the king had seemed particularly thoughtful lately, more reflective than usual about family matters. He's been asking about family photographs, Sir Michael said quietly as they approached the study door. Specifically, he's been looking through albums of you and your brothers as children. I haven't seen him spend so much time with personal photographs in years. This information both encouraged and pained Anne. The idea that her father was revisiting memories of their childhood, perhaps seeing them through the same new lens of regret that colored her own recent reflections, suggested that his desire for change was genuine and deep. When Sir Michael knocked on the study door and announced her arrival, and heard her father's voice, warm but surprised, inviting her in. As she entered the room, she immediately noticed what Sir Michael had mentioned. Several photograph albums were open on a side table, displaying images of royal family gatherings from decades past. King Charles stood to greet his daughter, and was struck by something in his expression that she had rarely seen before, a kind of hopeful nervousness, as if he sensed that this visit was different from their usual meetings, but didn't know whether to expect something wonderful or concerning. "And, my dear," he said, embracing her with slightly more warmth than their typical greeting. "I was delighted when Michael told me you wanted to meet today. I hope everything is well." "Everything is fine, Papa," she replied, using the informal address she had rarely used since childhood. The words seemed to surprise them both, and saw something shift in her father's eyes, a softening that encouraged her to continue. "I wanted to speak with you about something important, something personal." Charles gestured to the comfortable chairs near the fireplace, away from his desk, and the formal atmosphere it created. As they sat down, and noticed that her hands were trembling slightly, and she realized that despite decades of public speaking and royal engagements, this was perhaps the most nervous she had ever felt before a conversation. "Papa," she began, then paused, gathering courage. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to know that I'm not sharing this to cause any distress, but because I think it's important for both of us." Charles looked at her with growing concern and curiosity. "Of course, darling. You can tell me anything," and took a deep breath. "3 days ago, I came to your study to discuss the Scotland visit. The door was slightly open, and I overheard your conversation with Sir Michael. I heard what you said about your regrets as a father, about your wish to rebuild relationships with your children." She watched her father's face carefully, expecting to see embarrassment or perhaps withdrawal, but instead she saw something that looked almost like relief. "I should have knocked," she continued quickly. "I should have announced myself properly. But, Papa, what I heard wasn't something I could simply forget or pretend hadn't happened." Charles was quiet for a long moment, and could see him processing this revelation. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but steady. "What did you think about what you heard?" The question surprised her. Instead of defensiveness or embarrassment about his private moment being overheard, her father was asking for her perspective, inviting her into the conversation rather than shutting it down. "I thought about how much courage it must have taken for you to acknowledge those feelings," and said honestly. "And I thought about how much we've both missed by maintaining the distance that we thought was appropriate for our roles." Charles leaned forward slightly, his attention completely focused on his daughter. "Tell me more about what you mean," and felt the walls she had built around her emotions beginning to crumble. "I realized that I've spent my entire life trying to earn your love through service and duty, when what I actually wanted was simply to know that you enjoyed my company. I wanted to know that you were proud of me not because I never caused scandals or because I fulfilled my royal obligations efficiently, but because I was your daughter and you delighted in who I am as a person." The words came out in a rush, and felt exposed in a way she hadn't experienced since childhood. But Charles didn't look uncomfortable or withdrawn. Instead, he looked deeply moved. "My dear girl," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I have always been proud of you, not for your royal service, though that has been exemplary, but for your strength, your integrity, your kindness, your remarkable ability to remain authentically yourself despite all the pressures of our life. I've been proud of you since you were a small child, but I realize now that I never learned how to express that properly," and felt tears beginning to form. "I need you to know that overheard conversation changed everything for me. It made me realize that we've both been prisoners of the same system, both trying to do our best within constraints that maybe don't have to exist anymore." "What do you mean?" Charles asked. I mean that maybe it's time we stopped being so afraid of being real with each other, and replied. Maybe it's time we stopped hiding behind protocol when what we both want is connection. Charles stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the palace gardens, and wondered if she had pushed too far, if this level of emotional honesty was more than their relationship could bear. But when he turned back to her, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. And you've always been the bravest of my children, he said. You've taken on impossible challenges, worked with difficult situations, faced criticism and praise with equal grace. But what you're doing right now, giving us both permission to be vulnerable with each other, this might be the bravest thing you've ever done. And stood as well, feeling a connection with her father that she couldn't remember experiencing since early childhood. Papa, your wish to rebuild relationships with your children, I want to help you with that. But I also want to rebuild our relationship, not based on duty or royal roles, but based on who we actually are. What would that look like? Charles asked, and thought for a moment. It would look like having conversations where we talk about more than engagements and charitable work. It would look like you telling me about things that interest you, not just things that are important to the monarchy. It would look like me sharing my thoughts and feelings without worrying about whether they're appropriate for a princess to have. Charles smiled, and realized it was the first completely unguarded smile she had seen from him in years. I would like that very much, he said. And I need you to know that if we're going to have a different kind of relationship, it means I need to acknowledge how much I've failed you as a father. I need you to know that my distance wasn't because I didn't love you or wasn't proud of you. It was because I was so afraid of failing in my royal duties that I convinced myself that emotional reserve was a form of strength. Papa, and said gently, what if we stopped focusing on past failures and started focusing on present possibilities? What if we decided that today is the first day of a different kind of father-daughter relationship? Charles looked at her with wonder. You would be willing to do that? To start fresh with me? I would be honored to do that, and replied. But I want you to know that it's going to require both of us to be brave in ways we've never been before. It's going to mean admitting when we're hurt or confused or need something from each other. It's going to mean letting each other see us as human beings, not just as royal figures. I'm ready for that, Charles said with conviction. I've spent too many years already keeping my children at a distance in the name of preparing them for royal life. But what good is preparing someone for royal duty if you sacrifice the human connection that makes the duty meaningful? And felt something shift fundamentally in her relationship with her father at that moment. The formal distance that had characterized their interactions for decades was dissolving, replaced by something warmer and more authentic. There's something else, Papa, she said. If we're going to rebuild our relationship, I want to be part of helping you reach out to William and Harry too. I know those conversations will be more complicated, but I think they're possible. William has been carrying so much responsibility, and I think he would welcome knowing that you see him as more than just your heir. And Harry, and paused. Harry needs to know that he's not irredeemably lost to this family. Charles nodded slowly. I've been thinking about that constantly since my conversation with Michael. But I'm not sure how to begin those conversations without making things worse. Maybe we practice with each other first, and suggested. Maybe we learn how to be honest and vulnerable in our own relationship. And then we can apply those skills to healing the relationships with William and Harry. That sounds like wisdom, Charles said. And I need you to know that this can't be one-sided. If we're going to have a real relationship, I want to know about your life, your thoughts, your struggles, your joys. I want to be a father you can come to with problems, not just a king you report to about royal duties. And felt overwhelmed by the possibilities this conversation was opening up. For the first time in her adult life, she could imagine having a father who knew her as a complete person, who cared about her happiness and well-being beyond her royal performance. I'd like that more than you know, she said. But, Papa, we have to promise each other that we'll be patient with this process. We're both going to make mistakes as we learn how to have a different kind of relationship. We're both going to have moments where we fall back into old patterns. Agreed, Charles said firmly. And I also want you to promise me that you'll tell me when I'm reverting to old behaviors. I want you to help me become the father I should have been all along. As they spoke, and realized that they were creating something entirely new, not just a different father-daughter relationship, but a new model for how royal family members could relate to each other. They were choosing connection over protocol, authenticity over propriety, and love over duty as the foundation of their relationship. "Papa," and said as their conversation began to wind down, "there's one more thing I want you to know. Hearing you express your regrets, seeing you willing to be vulnerable about your mistakes, it doesn't diminish you in my eyes. It makes you more human, and somehow that makes you seem stronger, not weaker." Charles looked at his daughter with profound gratitude. "Thank you for giving me this gift, Anne. Thank you for having the courage to break down the walls we built between us. Thank you for helping me begin to fulfill my most profound wish." As Anne prepared to leave, she realized that this conversation had been the beginning of something revolutionary for both of them. They had chosen to prioritize their human connection over their royal roles, and in doing so, they had opened the door to possibilities neither of them had dared to imagine before. 2 weeks after her breakthrough conversation with her father, Princess Anne found herself in an unexpected position. King Charles had asked for her help with something that would have been unthinkable just a month earlier: crafting a personal letter to Prince Harry. Not a formal royal communication, not a message filtered through intermediaries or palace officials, but a genuine father-to-son letter expressing the emotions Charles had kept buried for years. They sat together in the king's private study on a quiet Sunday morning, the same room where Anne had overheard the conversation that changed everything. The atmosphere between them had transformed completely. Where once there had been formal courtesy and careful distance, there was now a warmth and ease that Anne had never imagined possible. They had spent the past 2 weeks having conversations unlike any in their previous relationship, talking about books they enjoyed, sharing memories from childhood, discussing their perspectives on life beyond royal duty. "I've written 17 different drafts," Charles admitted, showing Anne a stack of papers covered in his careful handwriting. "Each time I think I've found the right words, I read it back, and it either sounds too formal, too desperate, or too presumptuous. How do you write to your son who felt so misunderstood that he moved to another continent?" And reviewed several of the drafts, noting how each attempt revealed different aspects of her father's struggle to balance his royal identity with his parental heart. Some versions were too stiff, reading like official communications despite their personal content. Others were so emotional that they risked overwhelming Harry before he had a chance to process the outreach. "Papa," Anne said gently, "what would you say to Harry if he were sitting here right now? Not what would be appropriate to say, not what you think you should say, but what would your heart want him to know?" Charles closed his eyes for a moment, and could see him imagining that scenario. When he opened them, his voice was clear and certain. "I would tell him that I love him exactly as he is. I would tell him that I understand why he felt he had to leave, and that I'm proud of him for choosing to protect his family even when it meant sacrificing everything familiar. I would tell him that I miss him every day, not because the monarchy needs him, but because he's my son and I enjoyed his company and his perspective and his humor." "Then, that's what you should write," Anne said simply. Charles picked up his pen and began writing again, this time with less hesitation, and watched as her father poured his heart onto the page, finally, writing as a parent rather than as a king. The letter that emerged was unlike anything she had ever seen from him: vulnerable, honest, and completely authentic. "My dear Harry," Charles had written, "I know that communication between us has been difficult for a long time, and I take full responsibility for the patterns that developed in our relationship. I'm writing to you now not as your king, but as your father, to tell you things I should have said years ago. I want you to know that I understand why you and Meghan felt you had to step away from royal life. I understand that the pressures and expectations felt overwhelming, and that you didn't feel supported in the way you needed. Looking back, I can see how the institution that I dedicated my life to serving failed to protect you and Meghan in the ways that mattered most. I'm proud of the life you've built in California. I'm proud of how you've prioritized your mental health, your marriage, and your children's well-being. I'm proud that you've found your own path to service and meaning, even though it looks different from what any of us expected. Watching you become a father has shown me the kind of present, engaged parent I wish I had been able to be for you. I miss you, son. I miss your laughter, your questions that challenged me to think differently, your passion for causes you believe in. I miss knowing what's happening in your daily life, hearing your voice, being part of your children's lives in meaningful ways. I know that I forfeited the right to these things through my own choices and mistakes, but I want you to know that the absence of our relationship has been one of the greatest sources of pain in my life. I'm not writing to ask you to come back, to resume royal duties, or to fix everything immediately. I'm writing to tell you that you will always be my son, that my love for you has never been conditional on your royal role, and that if there's ever a way for us to rebuild some form of relationship that works for the life you've chosen, I would treasure that opportunity. I know I can't undo the years of emotional distance, the times I prioritized duty over being present for you, or the ways the institution harmed you and your family. But I hope that someday we might find a way forward that honors both your need for independence and my desire to be your father in whatever way you're willing to allow. Charles signed the letter simply, "Love, Papa," the name Harry had called him as a small child, before royal protocol had created distance between them, and read the finished letter with tears in her eyes. "Papa, this is beautiful. It's honest without being dramatic. It takes responsibility without wallowing in guilt. And it opens the door without pressuring him to walk through it." "Do you think he'll respond?" Charles asked, and could hear both hope and fear in his voice. "I don't know," and answered truthfully. "But I think this letter gives him the best possible chance to respond authentically, whatever that looks like for him. You've given him permission to engage on his own terms." They spent another hour discussing how to send the letter. Charles wanted it to be personal, not filtered through official channels, and suggested that she reach out to their mutual friend, Mike Tyndall, who had maintained relationships with both sides of the family divide, and might be willing to facilitate the delivery. 3 days later, Mike confirmed that he had personally delivered the letter to Harry during a private visit to California. All they could do now was wait. Meanwhile, and encouraged her father to focus on the relationships that were more accessible. William was still in London, still working closely with their father on royal duties, but their interactions remained largely professional despite their underlying affection for each other. "Have you considered asking William to bring the children for a purely personal visit?" and suggested during one of their now regular weekly conversations. "Not for a royal engagement or official photographs, but just to spend time together as grandfather and grandchildren?" Charles looked surprised by the suggestion. "I wouldn't want to interfere with their schedule or impose on Catherine's plans with the children." "Papa," and said with gentle exasperation, "you're their grandfather. Grandparents are supposed to want to spend time with their grandchildren. That's not imposing, that's being family." This concept seemed revelatory to Charles. He had been so careful to respect William and Catherine's autonomy as parents, so determined not to repeat what he saw as his own parents' mistakes of being overly involved in royal child-rearing, that he had swung to the opposite extreme of rarely requesting personal time with his grandchildren. The following weekend, Charles tentatively called William with an unusual request. Instead of discussing upcoming engagements or state business, he asked if the children might like to come to Highgrove for a Saturday afternoon, not for any official purpose, but simply to play in the gardens and spend time with their grandfather. William was so surprised by the request that he initially thought his father was planning some sort of royal event he had forgotten about. When Charles explained that he simply wanted to enjoy his grandchildren's company, William's response was immediately positive. "Of course, Papa," William had said. "The children would love that. They've been asking about the treehouse at Highgrove, and George wants to show you how much better he's gotten at football." The visit that followed was unlike any Charles had experienced as a grandfather. Without the pressure of royal protocols or official schedules, he found himself truly present with George, Charlotte, and Louis in ways he had never been with his own children. They explored the garden together, played impromptu games, and Charles found himself laughing more freely than he had in years, and had arranged to stop by during the visit, ostensibly to discuss some charitable work, but actually to witness this new version of her father in action. What she saw moved her deeply. Charles was on his hands and knees with Louis, helping him hunt for interesting stones in the garden. He was listening intently to Charlotte's elaborate stories about her school friends. He was genuinely engaged with George's questions about everything from football tactics to why leaves change color. But what struck him most was the look on William's face as he watched his father with the children. She could see surprise, appreciation, and what looked like a kind of healing happening in real time. William was seeing his father as the grandfather he had always had the potential to be, but also perhaps reimagining their own relationship in light of this newfound emotional availability. During a quiet moment while the children were playing on the swings, William approached his father. "Papa," he said, "I want you to know how much this means to them. And to me. Seeing you just enjoying their company, being present with them the way you are today, it's wonderful." Charles looked at his eldest son with emotion clear in his eyes. "William, I want you to know that I see how extraordinary you are as a father. You've learned to balance your royal responsibilities with being present for your children in ways I never mastered. I'm proud of the father you've become, and I hope I can learn from your example." And watch this exchange from a distance, and realized that her father's healing wasn't just about addressing past mistakes. It was about actively creating new patterns of connection and appreciation. He was learning to express pride in his children not for their royal service, but for who they were as people, and this was creating space for deeper relationships to develop. Later that evening, as